My name is Elena Marquez Rivera. I'm 34 years old. I live in a small, weathered row house on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. The kind of street where maple leaves cling to the gutters in the fall and the city's sirens sound like distant seasons. Right now, I'm a night shift nurse at a long-term care facility 2 towns over. And during the day, I am the executor of a house that smells like old cigarettes and lemon cleaner, the legal custodian of 2 graveside plots, and the unwilling heir to a lifetime of hushes. I tell you that because I need you to know the baseline. Tired bones, a schedule governed by alarms and meds, a throat that swallows the words that stay inside. My life until 3 months ago had become a ledger. Shifts logged, pills given, phone calls to insurance companies, weekly grocery trips for 2 people who called me their daughter but called me everything except family in the ways that mattered. After my parents died in the same week, Dad finally won his long argument with heart disease and Mom stopped waking up the week later. I thought I would be released from the quiet labor of caretaking. Instead, I walked into a courtroom. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. We were in the probate courtroom at the county courthouse on a wet Tuesday. Rain smeared the courthouse steps and pooled along the carved lions that guarded the doors. Inside, the air smelled of institutional coffee and dust, a long fluorescent hum above us. My brother Michael sat a row ahead of me, knees wide. A college hoodie he'd had since we were teenagers clinging to him like an old identity. His hair was longer than I remembered. His tattoos visible at the collars. He greeted me with the kind of tight smile that has always made my chest hollow. When the probate judge shuffled in, everyone quieted. My parents' lawyer, a brittle man in a navy suit named Mr. Coulter, read in his slow ceremonial way that felt like a performance. Last will and testament of Rose and Daniel Rivera, deceased. He read the sections about the house, the life insurance, the small savings account they'd had. I braced for what I thought would be fair. The house left to be sold and split, maybe a token to Michael, and the rest to me because I'd been the one who sat in hospital rooms, changing dressings and listening to the same stories about Florida vacations that my parents hadn't actually taken. Then Mr. Coulter stopped. He looked at my brother a second too long and said, louder than necessary, "The decedents have indicated and instructed their attorney that all tangible personal property and the entirety of the estate is to be set aside for their son, Michael Rivera. It's all for your brother." The sentence landed like a slab of ice in my lap. The room shrank. My stomach folded in on itself. For a beat I thought someone had made a mistake. Maybe there had been a previous will, maybe the pages had been mixed. But then my mother, or rather, the attending nurse who'd been administering the care plan that the will reflected during the last months of my parents' lives, spoke across the room in a voice shaking with too much humidity. "They want Michael to have it," she repeated, as if reading a text message aloud. And that's when the judge stopped the reading. Not with the slow turning of legal pages, but with a sudden, sharp wait. He folded his hands and, unusually for probate ceremonies where the judge mostly acts as referee, leaned forward and fixed his gaze on the 2 of us. "This court is going to put a hold on any distribution," he said. "There are allegations of undue influence and inconsistent testamentary capacity. We will not proceed until we establish the facts." It felt like someone had placed a hand over my mouth and then, after a second, started squeezing. I remember the cold of the courthouse chair against my legs, the metallic click of the coffee cup on the table in front of me, and the way my fingers were trembling but no one could see because I folded them into a folded napkin and pretended I wasn't falling apart. Michael leaned back and smiled like we were back in a college apartment watching game footage. "They always wanted me to have what was mine," he said casually, and the words crawled under my skin. The judge's interruption felt like a miracle. And a punishment. For 20 years I had felt like the invisible ledger keeper of this family, the person who scheduled meds, drove to appointments, swallowed insults, and then, with the estate reading that day, my parents and their lawyer seemed intent on erasing that life and giving everything instead to the son who'd left for the son years ago, returned to shadow deals, and arrived at their bedside with the right tone and the right excuses. The judge's voice snapped the room into a slow, electric tension that made my bones ache. There is so much to unpack about why a judge would grip a hearing like that, and why my breath felt like a brittle thing at the bottom of my lungs. The rest of it, the custody of money, the whispers of a different will, the receipts hidden in shoe boxes, the text messages my mother deleted, all started there, in that fluorescent room under the hum of the courthouse ceiling. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I promise the next part gets darker and harder, but it's necessary. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. The first time I learned what favoritism smells like, it was apple pie cooling on a windowsill. My father walked into the kitchen humming and gave Michael the last slice. He said it with the kind of indulgent smile that always left me clutching an invisible empty plate. That small theft, a slice of pie passed with affection, was how my parents taught me who I was supposed to be in our house. The steady one, the invisible one, the person you could rely on to smooth over things and then disappear from them. We grew up in a small split level in Parma that weathered winters like old coats. My mother worked 2 jobs until she couldn't anymore. She wore aprons with lipstick stains, and she kept a lipstick-stained calendar with Michael's milestones circled in red ink. Michael was charismatic the way some people are sunrise. Raw, attention-grabbing, easy to love on instinct. I was the rain. Necessary, steady, rarely remarked upon. When I was 20, Dad had a stroke that shifted the axis of our home. Mom couldn't carry his groceries anymore. Michael, who just left for a job in Florida and for months had sent enough postcards to make us think he might return, called once. I dropped out of a 2-year nursing program and started shifts, nights and days. A life rearranged into pillboxes and dietitian calls and arguments about whether Dad would take his blood pressure med. People thanked me with a distance that felt like pity. Michael sent money once, then another time, and then stopped. He made appearances at holidays with stories about a ran with the wrong crowd explanation, like a character in a novel who could apologize and then be granted forgiveness without consequence. There were cracks in the house. My mother's temper thickened into a kind of guilt that thundered when the electricity bill went unpaid. My father mumbled apologies that sounded like a sandpapered confession. He'd look at Michael on TV news clips sometimes and then at me, and he'd say nothing. Silence was our family's currency. You can't imagine how much your brother's been through, they'd tell me. He's the one who needs our help. I learned to swallow that, along with the scratch of the orange pill bottles and the metallic tang of the hospital coffee. I remember the night Michael reappeared for real. He came home with a duffel and a smile that had teeth missing, like some of his stories. He arrived thin and sunburned, smelling of motor oil and cheap whiskey, and he persuaded Mom, with tears and promises, to let him come back. Suddenly he was there at the kitchen table, and they were folded into him the way moths fold into a lamp, dazzled and disoriented. He took to sitting with Dad in the evenings and recounting stories about those days, with an intensity that made Dad laugh louder than he had in years. Mom started to defer, eyes wet, saying, "He sacrificed so much, you have to understand." The economy of sympathy shifted. When my father's health took a turn in the last year and hospice became a word we all used, Michael stepped in with legal pads and assertive sentences. He learned quickly how to sign forms and how to charm the right nurses. He had that terrifying combination of being a familiar face, our boy who'd gone wrong, and someone who could talk to doctors as if he'd taken a class on it. At night I would sit in my car in the hospital lot and try not to scream. I'd replay the times I had dragged Dad to rehab, the times I'd washed his hair, the nights I'd sat with him while he coughed and told the same stories for the 100th time. I had been there in the deep, grinding work. Michael had been there in flashes that looked good on camera. The day of the will reading, when Mr. Coulter enunciated that everything went to Michael, images came at me in parallax. The apple pie slice, the years I'd handed Mom her pills, the nights at the hospice with my knuckles white on the plastic chair. The judge stopped the reading then, and for the first time in my life, I felt like someone else might see the ledger I'd been keeping. Maybe this wasn't just bitterness. Maybe it was theft. But there were also practicalities. The house had to be maintained. My shifts were already a threadbare rope of exhaustion. How do you fight a brother who has charm and momentum and a polished narrative about returning to make things right? How do you argue against a man who could, in the span of a night, tell our parents that their daughter had abandoned them, and then stand in a courtroom with an arm around their memories and look like the only sane person in the room? I started looking for evidence. This is the kind of thing that quiet people do. We collect receipts, texts, hospital logs. I combed through email archives, found old voicemails, and asked the hospice nurse for copies of visitation logs. There were oddities. Signatures on forms that didn't match my parents' usual scrawl, a string of gas receipts showing Michael's car at the hospital at all hours, and a series of emails between him and Mr. Coulter that started to smell like orchestration. One night I sat at the kitchen table with a flashlight and a shoebox of old papers from my mother's closet. The house felt hollow without the steady back-and-forth noise of their arguments. The shoebox had a lock of Dad's hair, grocery lists, and an envelope with a small, faded photograph of the three of us on a summer pier. Tucked under the photo was a single folded page that read, in my father's shaky, looping handwriting, "Elena, the house so you can keep my things. Mike can't take care of me." I read it twice, then a third time. My heart performed a slow, careful flip. That single paper was everything and nothing. It could be the remnant of an old will, a line in an undated note. I didn't know what it was worth in court, but I held it like a talisman. It was the first real personal thing that said I mattered. If this is resonating with you, a like really helps. And if you've ever kept a shoebox of memories that saves something for you, share so I don't feel alone in this odd, lonely triumph. After I found the folded note, things accelerated with the sort of cold mechanical precision that legal processes have. The judge had already entered the initial hold on distribution. An estate attorney for the county assigned a neutral conservator to audit the transactions. Suddenly, our grieving living room became a battlefield mapped in ledgers and bank statements. The conservator, Ms. Hargreaves, insisted on cataloging everything. Credit card statements, life insurance beneficiaries, mortgage documents, even the coffee club membership my mother had paid for in case she wanted someone to talk to. Her office smelled faintly of tea and disinfectant. She had soft eyes that did not soften when she read numbers. Michael, for his part, played the part of the grieving son so well that people leaned toward him in hallways, offering their condolences like currency. He said the right things to neighbors. He cried at the right moments and stood stoically when the cameras flashed at the funeral mass. He started showing up at my shifts, which felt like a kind of invasion, catching me in my nursing scrubs with my hair pulled into a knot, handing out too familiar jokes and asking me about old times, as if he was mining my exhaustion for new narratives. One afternoon the conservator called me into her office, a neutral room with a faux plant wilting in a corner and a glass pitcher of water that sweated onto the table. "We found inconsistencies in the last document signed," she told me. "There are handwriting variations. Also, and this is delicate, there's evidence of large cash withdrawals coinciding with visits from your brother to Mom's bedside." I felt the room tilt. "What kind of withdrawals?" I asked, my voice a dry rope. "2 withdrawals for $3,000 each in a single week. A number of checks written out to cash. Also, there's a change of beneficiary form filed 4 months ago designating your brother as primary beneficiary for both a life insurance policy and the small retirement account." My insides unraveled into a brittle kind of logic. The note in my mother's shoebox suddenly hummed with possibility. I handed it to Ms. Hargreaves. She took it with gloves and folded it under a sheet of paper as if it were evidence. We went to the county clerk's office the next day and requested an official copy of the last known will. The clerk, a woman named Jenna with freckles and a punk haircut, pushed a printout across the counter like a verdict. The printed will had my parents' signatures and dated 6 months prior to their deaths, a straightforward disposition. House to me, cash split, and a small trust set aside for medical needs. A codicil, dated 2 weeks before, was attached. It was the new one. It named Michael as sole heir and was witnessed by Mr. Coulter and, peculiarly, by a hospice volunteer. My stomach bile rose like a tide. "Is that signature mine?" I found myself asking Jenna, as if I ever had any authority there. The clerk shrugged. "Not our place," she said. "If you contest it, it goes to litigation." Contesting a will is a strange and naked fight. It's not two people arguing in a living room. It is paragraphs and depositions, affidavits and handwriting experts. It's a process that reduces intimacy to a spreadsheet. The judge, to his credit, ordered a hearing to determine the validity of the codicil and placed a temporary injunction on the assets pending the result. Michael, in the halls of the courthouse, clapped me on the back and said, "We'll get through this, Lena. Don't make it worse than it needs to be." His voice was syrupy. I wanted to tell him that he had made everything worse the moment he returned. I wanted to tell him how many nights I'd spent holding my father's hand while he gasped, how many times I had cancelled shifts and missed sleep. I wanted justice, and justice in this country moves like a glacier, slow, inevitable, and indifferent to the small aches. The court date for the evidentiary hearing arrived 2 months later, and for weeks I prepared like a person rehearses for a storm. Copies of visitation logs, the shoebox letter, phone records, and a notebook where I'd written down every conversation that felt like manipulation. I learned the strange intimacy of repetition, turning the same memories over like flat coins to see if any side had gloss to it. I found an old voicemail from Mom tucked beneath a long string of star codes and promotional messages. In it, she said in clear and halting words, "Elena, I don't want Michael to take the house. He won't take care of it. Promise me you'll keep it." Her voice broke on promise. I cried in my car until the wipers lost rhythm. On the morning we walked into the courtroom, fall had stripped most of the maples bare, and the wind outside shoved cold air under the courthouse doors. The building tasted like metal and lemon cleaner and the memory of too many other people's business. The judge, an older man with a cropped white beard and a stare that could be kind or withering, called us to the bench. He listened as lawyers spoke in measured monotone. The crux was competence. Had my parents had the mental capacity to alter their will in the days before they died? Had Mr. Coulter coached them? Did Michael exert pressure? The term undue influence felt like a sharp clinical knife applied to the soft things of our lives. Midway through the hearing, my brother's attorney presented a stack of documents. A notarized statement from a hospice volunteer who said she heard my mother express that she wanted Michael to have everything for reasons of care and legacy. Michael stood and repeated the stories of his sacrifices. He looked like the son who had finally come home to claim his inheritance and had dressed the part. But the turning point, the moment the judge's face changed from neutral to something like consideration, came when my attorney, a woman named Lila with a fierce braid and a soundproof anger, put the voicemail on the stand and played it for the court. Mom's voice, small and raw, filled the room. "Promise me you'll keep it," she said, and in the silence that followed, even Michael couldn't manufacture dry eyes. The judge, to my surprise, called a recess and asked for a handwriting analysis. "We need certainty," he said. "No one will distribute until we are sure the decedent's intentions are properly represented." I left the courthouse that day feeling both vindicated and exhausted, like someone who had run to the edge of the cliff and not yet stepped off. If you're following this, don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. Also, if you've ever had to fight for a parent's wishes in court, please tell me in the comments. Your voices matter more than you know. The pre-trial months were a study in small cruelties. There were court dates to reschedule, depositions where strangers asked me to recount nights that had been everything to me, and the slow, grinding erosion of normative privacy. We lived like animals in a landscape of paper. My brother's mood swung between performative sorrow and sharp defensiveness. He started showing up at our parents' funeral with different friends, men who looked like they'd been picked from late-night bars and introduced as support. In the background of every hug and every condolence, there was the hum of litigation. But litigation has a way of making people reveal themselves. On a rainy December afternoon, the conservator called me and said she needed to meet me at the hospice where Mom had passed. She had ordered a detailed review and had found something that made her voice drop into a whisper when she spoke. "Bring anything you think might help," she said. I took the shoebox and the voicemail on a thumb drive and walked past the rehabilitation wing where a man in a hospital gown sang softly to himself. The hospice smelled like antiseptic and lemon. In a conference room with peeling paint, Ms. Hargreaves laid out a series of documents: bank withdrawals, a ledger of cash transfers, and a set of messages between Michael and my mother. The messages were, at first glance, standard. But when Ms. Hargreaves pointed out the timeline, the texts clustered around the nights that my mother was on oxygen and confused. The pattern emerged like a map. The messages had a cadence to them. "You need help, Mom. Let me handle this. We'll set things right." Then there were messages that leaned paternalistic. "Do as I say." She had also found emails between Michael and a man who used to be his partner in a small roofing business. These emails included instructions for forging a signature and a discussion about making sure it reads right for the attorney. I read those lines as if they were a new language. A cold, electric anger rose up from my ribs. Michael had not simply charmed his parents. He had orchestrated, manipulated, and it seemed arranged for documents to be created in ways that fit his narrative. We took the new evidence to the judge. The court convened an emergency hearing, and people crowded the room in a way that felt like a physical weight. Michael's attorney tried to dismiss the messages as normal caregiving language, but the pattern was a puzzle piece clicking into place. The neighborhood witness, a hospice volunteer who'd been named on the codicil, admitted under cross-examination that she had been introduced to Mr. Coulter by Michael, and that she had been privy to a conversation in which Michael told her his mother kept changing her mind, and that we'd better do it soon. The judge, who had been calculating quietly from the bench like a man solving a complicated equation, turned his attention to Michael. He didn't shout. He asked careful, exacting questions. "Did you ever threaten either of your parents to change a document?" he asked. There was a pause. Michael's jaw clenched. "No, Your Honor," he said. His voice had that rehearsed flatness I knew so well. "Did you ever suggest legal measures to secure property because you were concerned for their well-being?" The judge pressed. "Yes," Michael admitted. "But only to help. I only ever suggested what's best." The judge's next move surprised both of us. He ordered that the signatures on the contested codicil be examined by a forensic handwriting analyst. He also ordered Michael to undergo a full accounting of his finances for the year, and a temporary restraining order preventing him from accessing any of the estate funds until the matter was resolved. More than that, the judge required a professional geriatric psychologist to review my parents' records and give an opinion on their testamentary capacity in the days prior to the codicil signing. When the psychologist's report came back, it mirrored the intuition I'd carried for months. My parents had episodes of confusion and medication-induced clouding during the period in which the codicil was allegedly executed. There were notes on the side of the nurse's chart about Mom's oscillating lucidity and Dad's increasing forgetfulness. The forensic handwriting analyst reported inconsistencies in the codicil signature, pressure variances, and an apparent tremor that did not match my father's steady hand in earlier documents. The weight of evidence began to tilt in my direction like a slow, inevitable balancing scale. The day the judge issued a provisional ruling, the courthouse felt like an altar. He did not declare the codicil void outright. He said he required more time for final adjudication, but he did void its immediate effect, affirming the older will as the operative document pending a final hearing. He placed the estate in a temporary trust with Ms. Hargreaves as trustee and ordered Michael to stay away from the property and any financial accounts. When the gavel came down, I felt something break and rebuild in the same instant. Relief rushed in, scrambled and clumsy, and then a hollow emptied where anger had lived. Michael stared at me with something like betrayal in his eyes. "You'll regret making me fight you," he said quietly, as if warning me that familial violence might come in the form of legal and emotional sabotage. What I realized then, sitting under the harsh courthouse lights with my shoebox of old papers and a voicemail that had been my father's last audible trust, was that justice is not a tidy transaction. It is messy and sweaty and often uncertain. Even when the courts do something right, the family's bones are still fractured. Michael could be prevented from walking into the house with keys, and yet he could still walk into my memories and seed doubts with words. In the weeks that followed, I learned how to live with victory that tasted like ash. The judge's decision felt like a reprieve rather than a resolution. There would be hearings, appeals, and the slow calculus of settlement. I found myself feeling triumphant and exhausted in equal measure, like a climber who had scaled a wall only to find more wall beyond the top. If this resonates, please drop a like. And if you're dealing with a family fight like this, remember, proof matters. Keep emails, text messages, visit logs. Can feel like betrayal to keep those things, but sometimes those records are the only things standing between you and the theft of your history. The final hearing felt prophetic in its quietness. Snow had dusted the courthouse steps, and the city moved cautiously under a gray sky. Michael's lawyer framed the dispute as a contest between a prodigal son's intention and a daughter's resentment. My lawyer, Lila, who'd become a friend rather than simply a legal representative, framed it differently, as a clear picture of manipulation, documented and deliberate. On the stand, Michael's composure frayed. The forensic analyst testified about the signature irregularities, the geriatric psychologist about the cognitive lapses during the codicil's purported signing. Hospice staff recounted the night Michael had insisted a particular nurse tells mom what's best. The jury, if there were one, would have been invisible, but the judge listened. When he reached his ruling, he did so with a conductor's steady authority. He declared the codicil invalid due to undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity at the time of signing. He affirmed the prior will as the operative document and ordered the estate distributed accordingly. The house to me, the small retirement fund to be split between a trust for medical needs and an allocation to Michael under strict conditions tied to rehabilitation efforts, and a designated portion held in reserve for possible future claims. He also ordered that Michael seek court-approved counseling and contribute to the costs of the conservator's investigation. I cried in the hallway after the hearing in the way I hadn't expected to, not purely in triumph, but because the sound of my parents' names in the judge's voice made me feel like the ledger I'd kept had been seen. People came up to me with husbandly, auntish, and neighborly hands on my shoulder. Many offered condolences, some offered dollar amounts of sympathy. Michael did not approach. He stood a distance away, a figure in a dark coat, and watched me with a face like a pronouncement. What followed was not clean. There were evenings where the house felt too loud with memories, the wallpaper a map of every faded argument and quiet dinner. There were times I opened the closet and thought, maybe I should have taken the money and run. The house, when the keys finally came, felt like a place that still had ghosts to be negotiated. I hired a locksmith, fixed a leaking roof, attended to stacks of unpaid bills that had mounted under the guise of planning. I found more letters in the attic, written in my father's hand, small notes that reminded me of who we had been, rickety and messy but ours. Michael sued. He filed appeals and motions, calls that came late at night where his voice was sometimes pleading and sometimes accusatory. We argued over what counts as care and what counts as performance. He told me that he loved our parents and that he'd done his best. I told him that best doesn't include forging a parent's will and that loving someone isn't a license to take everything under their name. The legal victory did not heal the family. My mother's calendar still had circles around dates that meant nothing without the people they once promised. I continued to work nights at the nursing home and days in the paperwork of estate management. I learned to take joy in small, stubborn things. A cup of coffee that didn't spill, an intact roof over my head, the sound of my father's old radio when I turned it on in the kitchen on lazy Sunday mornings. There were unexpected reconciliations and hardened rifts. A couple of cousins reached out with stories about my father keeping receipts for his own reasons, apologizing for not listening when I had complained about Michael. Some friends of Michael's wrote letters to the court, bearing witness to a different side of him that I did not recognize. The funny friend, the man who'd changed and struggled. I read those letters and held both images in my hand. People are more than one thing, and truth is rarely pure in the mouths of those we love. In the end, the judge's ruling didn't fix the past. It did, however, buy me a kind of right to continue. It allowed me to honor the small, quiet requests my father had made that I carried like coins in my pocket. It allowed me to keep the house that held our history and to turn it into something that might, in time, become less about keeping and more about healing. The lesson I carry is messy and simple at once. love does not exempt us from accountability. Care is not an excuse to override another's autonomy. If someone in power pressures an elder, if the quiet words in the dark are replaced by legal pressure and groomed consent, speak up. Keep records. Ask for witnesses. Legal systems are imperfect, but they can be a scaffolding for truth when truth needs the muscle of evidence. Michael and I may never sit across a kitchen table and have a tidy, forgiving conversation. Maybe we will. Maybe all I will ever get are the small victories of a roof fixed and the history of a family preserved. Either way, that judge's interruption, that wait, saved more than an estate. It saved the idea that my parents' lives meant something beyond the performances of grief. If this story touched something inside you, please consider subscribing. If you're in the middle of a fight like this, know that you're not alone. Speak to advocates, keep notes, and be kind to yourself on the long road. And if you can, forgive, not because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve peace. Closing note. We rarely get tidy endings in life. What we can aim for is clarity, boundaries, and a commitment to truth, even when telling it hurts.